Hi, Mary.
Hello.
Hi, Shari.
Hi.
It's good to be back with you guys again in this little corner of the world. I'm Karen, for those of you who haven't met me yet, and we are all trying to tackle this thing called the meaning crisis as we've been following Jordan Peterson and Paul Vanderklay and all of the offshoots of that movement. So Mary had a topic that she wanted to talk about, and let's find out what that is.
Right. This was partly based on the work that John Vervaake's been doing on the meaning crisis, and I think he's right in that the meaning crisis is such a serious issue, and Paul Vanderklay, of course, thinks so too, and he's spoken about it. But I notice how Paul Vanderklay will talk a lot about the resurrection and the hope of the resurrection, and I started thinking that maybe the key thing in the meaning crisis, that maybe it's not just a meaning crisis, but maybe it's a hope crisis. That what people are lacking is hope. And I wanted to tease out with y'all, what do you think is the difference between having meaning and having hope, and what you think the connection might be between them, and if people lose hope in the life with God after death, is that going to cause them to lose meaning? And is that going to cause them to lose meaning, like, no matter what you do in terms of this world? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
In other words, we can do all kinds of things.
To be backing up just a little bit, there may be some people who haven't been following this idea of the meaning crisis. Could you describe briefly what is the meaning crisis and why people think that's a concern?
Okay, well, we can come at it from several angles. One thing is, we definitely have a population of people who are struggling with having meaning in their life, and they will even express it that way. I don't see any meaning in anything, and leads them to nihilism, leads them to things like addiction, depression, suicide, a lack of purpose in their life, a lack of an ability to find a place in society where they're productive. They'll even not bother to get their adult life together and start families, that kind of thing. And these people will actually say that they're lacking in meaning. Mm-hmm. Then we have a philosophical train, which John Vervaeke has been really good at laying out. The philosophical train, if you follow it down through the centuries of a time when people had a lot of meaning in their life, to where meaninglessness and the idea that that life does not have any transcendent meaning, that there's no life beyond this life, and all of that became kind of a pervasive philosophical viewpoint. So that feeds into it. Then, of course, there's the separation of large swaths of the population from the former robust participation in religious life, which seems to contribute to the meaning crisis. So you also have the other thing, which Paul Vanderklay has spoken about, and Sevilla King has spoken about, in terms of populations, that people who seem to be quite materially well off seem to struggle with meaning more than people who are not materially well off. The populations of people who are poorer still seem to find meaning, and it's the people whose material lives are quite comfortable often are the ones who, Paul Vanderklay, I think, recently spoke about this. They have everything to live for. They seem to have everything that everyone wants, and they're, found that they hung themselves someday or something like that. So this is what the meaning crisis is. It's an individual thing, and then it bleeds over into a societal thing, and that's what it is. It's that combination of a dislocation of people from the sources of things that gave their lives meaning in the past. So my wonder was, can we separate that out from the idea of people having hope? What's the connection between meaning and hope, do you think?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind when you equate meaning with hope is Viktor Frankl's book. The title is just escaping me at the moment.
A
Can you help
search,
me out?
a search for meaning.
Man's search for meaning. Yeah. And the beautiful thing about that book is that the setting is a concentration camp, right?
Mhm.
And people are throwing themselves up against the electric wire surrounding the camp and committing or finding other ways to commit suicide, and he's trying to give them reasons why they shouldn't do that. And so then he develops his logotherapy out of that experience, right? Which is the logos, which is truth. And so in that situation, I don't see a correlation between meaning and hope, because there is no hope when you're in a concentration camp. You can't not kill yourself because you think that maybe the Allies are going to free you, or the Germans are going to change their mind, or you'll never make it. You're not going to be the one to go into the ovens tomorrow. The chances of all those things happening are almost zero, right? So you have to find meaning in truth, in what the Germans would say, Dasein, like in being, right? And
So maybe it's the loss of hope that drives people finally to begin to search for meaning.
well, that's for sure. People do in suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
Seek meaning. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there is no correlation between meaning and hope,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the first thing that came to my mind was that whole scenario of his book, where
When you
people are in a
started
situation without hope.
When you started talking about that, Shari, I was thinking about a conversation I was having with my husband today about I live in Silicon Valley, and we have one of the highest suicide rates in the country here among young people that are in school. And a lot of it is that they are feeling so much pressure, even at a very young age, to figure out what life is all about and to figure out their careers and to push themselves to higher and better and all of that kind of thing. And my husband grew up in Hong Kong, and he said, well, they have no idea what pressure is, because the pressure we had in Hong Kong, when I was in 6th grade, I had to take a test that would determine which high school I got into. And if I didn't get into the right high school, then all hope was lost about any future whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And that pressure was there already. And then that reminded me that it was the same way in Japan when I was a missionary there, that the kids in Japan all have to take this test when they're in 6th grade. But I started thinking about it and thinking that, and when I grew up in the Midwest, it's not that life was easy, but we all had a certain amount of structure and expectation and strength that was required of us as we were growing up. And my husband certainly did in Hong Kong. You had to kind of build out your life muscles from a very young age, because life was hard. So by the time you got to this stressful place where you had to be making decisions in 6th or 7th grade, you already had some chops, so to speak. But here, where there's such an abundance of material comfort and material wealth, I think a lot of young people are growing up without the stress, without the normal stresses of life that teach you how to deal with stress and teach you how to deal with difficulty. And so when they face the stress of having to make these life choices and study difficult subjects in order to, and they see how kind of hopeless the financial situation looks, because to live in this area is so expensive that it almost doesn't matter. Even if you make $1 million a year, you're still living just barely a middle-class life. So it's all very weird. And these kids grow up without any internal muscle, and then they're still facing these very stressful decisions. So I think there's some of that involved too, you know, in this struggle between hope and meaning. And I do think there is a hopelessness that I see in a lot of these kids, that they can't see that there is any future. It all looks hopeless to them.
So,
and yet it's nothing whatever like the concentration camps, right? I mean, you know, nothing like that. And yet internally they have the same pain. Because I think our internal pain can be, it's so personal that there's no way to say, oh, well, you shouldn't have that much pain. You shouldn't have as much pain as these other people had because they had it worse. That's not really the way pain works, right?
No.
right.
Well, what kind of correlation do you see, Mary?
Well, one of the things I was talking about with my grandson, we're talking about, he's a 7th grader and I'm homeschooling him, and I was talking to him about the resurrection of Christ and trying to get him to understand how different the mentality of people was prior to the resurrection. That nobody had any idea of anything after death. There was no certainty, and even though the way that you would, quote unquote, survive death was either through your children, or if you happened to do something like be a great warrior so that you were in songs and people celebrated your life, that was a sense of survival. But the resurrection of Christ, I do believe, really transformed humanity. And one of the ways that it transformed people, the Bible says that mankind was enslaved because of death. You know, it's like there's no limit to what a tyrant, you could not put a limit on a tyrant because the tyrant could kill you. And it wasn't until after the resurrection of Christ that people, large numbers of people en masse, could find the courage to stand up against the tyrant. So I believe that the human move to greater and greater freedom for masses of people and liberation from slavery all has to do with the resurrection. It has to do with giving people the fortitude, because of the hope of the resurrection, to be able to stand up and say, you know, I may face this tyrant and this tyrant may kill me, but I will still resist because I know I have the hope of the resurrection. So I think that really was a fundamental.
That's an amazing insight, because we are enslaved by the fear of death, right? So,
right.
And the perfect love drives out fear. And Paul was talking today on, or maybe, I don't know when it was, but his video about the numinous and C.S. Lewis. And at the very end, he was talking about how this idea of the numinous and the transcendent before Christ did not have any element of love in it. But after Christ, because Christ brings in the element of love, so now the numinous and the love are one. And so that perfect love drives out the fear, so we are no longer enslaved by the fear, and that gives us the courage to face any circumstance.
Yes, and I think that shows in the move of human beings toward greater and greater freedom, because they could no longer be tyrannized. You could actually stand up to a tyrant and say, you know, I will not do what you say to do, because even if you kill me, I have a hope for the future.
Okay, but I'm just going to play devil's advocate. What if you're what if you're talking to someone who doesn't believe in God? You know, like, I think that the meaning crisis, and I don't want to put this in too simple a term, but I remember when I watched John Vervaeke's lecture on Martin Luther, and he talked about the divide and how, I think what he's kind of illustrating with that dive into philosophical history is how much farther and farther away we ended up from the transcendent, right?
Right.
So we start out, kind of living our lives in a, we're like stuck to the transcendent. It's part of our everyday existence. And then as a result of philosophy and theology and, God just gets further and further away, in a sense. Now, I'm not saying that life before the crucifixion was any better, but I think that there is something to that. And the reason I say that is kind of a real life illustration. I was in India, and I was staying in this small village, and one of the women in the village came to the house I was staying in and asked me if I would pray for her child who was sick. And there had been a YWAM team there before me, and they were doing a lot of, it was at the height of the charismatic movement, and so they were doing a lot of, laying on of hands, speaking in tongues, and a lot of that kind of thing, and, praying for people. And so for this woman, she felt that there was a power there that she wanted to tap into. She wanted to use that power to make her baby better because she was aware of spirituality. She was aware of the transcendent. She knew that there was a metaphysical realm out there, and she was just going to tap into it in whatever way she could, for the benefit of her child, which is what a good mother would do. And so she came to the house, and I knew she had made an appointment, so I knew she was coming, and I really prayed about it because I felt like whatever the interaction was that we had with each other, it would have to be more meaningful than that, right? More meaningful than just her tapping into the transcendent. And I asked the Lord, what do you want to say to this woman? What is it that you want her to know? And he said, he revealed to me through scripture that he wanted her to know that he was a jealous God, that he wanted her for himself, right? And so, like, if you would take that whole scenario and plunk it into a Western context, that discussion that I had with her about God wanting her to give up her idols and to worship him alone because he loved her that much. He wanted her for himself, right?
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't have that discussion with somebody in the West because they don't understand the transcendent, but she did. And she said to me, I can't do that because if I do, then the demons will cause my husband to lose his job, or my baby will die of this illness, or something bad will happen. And I said to her, well, I can tell you that God will heal your baby because he loves you, but he wants you for himself. He's not going to reserve healing because you haven't joined his team. He's going to heal your child, but he wants you to join his team. And she understood that. She understood that whole conversation about a jealous God, a God that wants her for his own. And that, and that was kind of the life that I saw in India. Was there was a keen awareness on an everyday basis that everybody was living in the realm of the physical and the metaphysical. And we don't have that in the West. And I think that that's really a part of the meaning crisis.
Well, isn't it that transcendent reality that gives us a hope that goes beyond this life?
Well, I think
no,
it gives us
I
a
think you guys are
deeper
talking
understanding.
I
Go
hear,
ahead, Karen.
hear you talking about two different things. So I get exactly what Shari's talking about, because when I was a missionary in Japan, I would notice that very same thing, especially with this kind of syncretistic idea that the Japanese would have, that they wanted Jesus, but they wanted to bring him in with all the other household gods, all the other family
Mm-hmm.
gods, and all of that thing. And at the same time, I was, when I would be at conferences with the other missionaries, one of our speakers was a missionary who had been in India for 30 years. And he said whenever he would go into people's homes, he would always pray with them. He and another missionary would go, and they would always pray with the people, because he said, where two or more are gathered, Jesus is there. And those people could actually feel the presence of Jesus in the room when they were praying. That never happens in America. That actual visceral sense of the transcendent. Now, we know, those of us who are believers, we know the transcendent exists, and we spend times in certain spiritual disciplines to come to a place of experiencing that, as well as experiencing it on an intellectual level. We can experience it on an emotional level and on a personal level. But in many of these, what other people might call backward places, they still live with a daily visceral experience of the spiritual realm. It's right there with them all the time. Very obvious to them. They know where the demons are. They know where, they know where the spirits are.
Right.
So Mary, when you said that, when you asked that question about, isn't
and science has, in a sense,
I'm sorry, what, Shari?
Oh, no, go ahead, Karen. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Mary asked the question about the transcendent and hope. That sounds more to me like you're asking from a theological space about it. Not theological, but assent or propositional truth.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, it's a propositional truth. I mean, it's presented to us propositionally in Scripture, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a statement that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, that this is what is the basis of our faith.
Right.
But it's also something that we do participate in. Mm-hmm. I would think that one of the ways we participate in it is that experience that we have of hope. Both hope for those, like when our loved ones pass away, we have hope. Mm-hmm. And also we have hope ourselves, and that hope is part of our meaning. So in other words, this life is so small, short, difficult, and limited. And if we have a horizon, we can see that there's a horizon of death to our life. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm trying to get at is that if you are only trying to find your meaning in this life, and you really analyze it and think about it, you realize that you are going to be losing everything that you have in this life. If all you have is this life, then I would think that your sense of meaning that it would be more difficult to have a sense of meaning. But that when you have a transcendent hope, when you have a hope that goes beyond this life, mm-hmm. that informs your life in a way that helps to engender meaning. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So ultimately, in order to have meaning, you have to acknowledge the transcendent. You have to acknowledge the metaphysical. You have to say that there is more than I can see. That life, that this life around me is comprised of more than I, can see, and that what I can't see is just as real or more real than what I can see. And I think that whole concept, like just removing Christ from that equation completely, just for the sake of argument, is what is missing in Western society. We have completely divorced the physical from the metaphysical. And when you do that, people they can't even transcend their own problems, right? They can't transcend anything. There's no ladder, to heaven, right? It's gone.
Right. Yeah.
And the ladder is the place where people go to seek. They climb that ladder to see what's at the top. And when they do that, they find truth. And Jesus said, I am the truth. So, if they seek, they will find. And so it goes. But without the ladder, it's like somebody's knocked the ladder down or taken it away. They have no hope of transcendence.
Or if they have misunderstood the ladder, like earlier Mary was talking about how sometimes it seems like the people that have the highest sense of material well-being are often the ones who struggle the most with meaning or struggle the most with hope. And today I was listening to, have you been following those 4 that are reading from A Grief Observed?
Yes, and I saw that you commented on that a lot. Yeah, that's been wonderful.
And it's just been absolutely amazing conversations. They're getting down to the depths of their own souls, and they're so unflinchingly raw and honest in their discussion of what they're reading. And today there was a line from A Grief Observed where C.S. Lewis is talking about how he experienced everything there was to experience in the matter of love with his wife. And in every aspect, sexual, relational, emotional, intellectual, they were able to taste all of the delights of earth. And he said, if faith were simply something that people look to when their needs are not being met, or if they're just hoping that they have something to replace the empty spots in their life. He said, I had no empty spots in my life. She had no empty spots in her life because we were so enthralled with each other. And yet we both wanted something more. And it is that human wanting something more, even when you have everything. So I think some of these people with the material wealth, they've climbed this ladder of success. They've climbed the ladder and gotten more and more prestige or more and more money, more and more fame. And yet they get up to the top and there's nothing there. So they're climbing the wrong ladder, right? And then there's no hope, there's no meaning. But we all have that longing. And so C.S. Lewis said in one of his earlier books, I think it was Mere Christianity, that when I find myself longing for something that I cannot satisfy in this world, that must mean that I was made for another world.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know what, when you talked about, in the beginning, when you talked about the suicide rate amongst the wealthy, and I would say, like Switzerland has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, and it's one of the wealthiest countries.
I didn't know that.
Japan does too, actually.
Yeah,
I think.
Japan has a really, especially amongst the young kids in Japan.
Yeah. So, and I think there's that whole idea that Peterson talks about of being in the exploratory mode. So, you find meaning in that place between chaos and order, right? And that is when you are in the exploratory mode. So you have one foot in order and one foot in chaos, and you're out there bringing back all the treasures, right? And then you're finding meaning. But when you have everything, what can you genuinely explore? You don't have to explore it. You can just have it sent over. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing, there's no, there's nothing left There's no chaos. It's like continual order in that sense. You don't have that 1 foot in order, 1 foot in chaos, and you're not in that exploratory mode, which then gives you meaning, right? I think that has something to do with it. I mean, that's just a really, superficial sweep over it, but I think that has something to do with it too, with the wealthy.
Well, John Vervaeke has made this point about how we find it deeply meaningful to get into this flow state where we're maximally engaged with the complexity of the world, but we're not overwhelmed by it.
Right.
So that might tie in with what you're saying about the exploratory mode. And he talks about people going rock climbing, how you can, but then I would still wonder, suppose you were a person who was very good at rock climbing, you found a lot of meaning in that, and you had some other things in your life that would put you into the flow state, right? So you're finding meaning in these things, and maybe you even have a work or a job that you find meaningful and that you feel is contributing to society, but you have no connection to the transcendent. You're still going to be looking at that horizon, at that, do you want to call it a deadline or whatever, that's rushing towards you, that your own mortality. And if you have nothing that's going to take you past that, if you have no hope of going past that, it still seems that all of these things would at some point begin to look pale or thin or not substantial enough for you that you would want something that's going to take you over that horizon.
Yeah, and I, in that conversation. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, that's what I mean by the hope.
Yeah, okay. In that conversation I had with Jeff, where he mentioned something about the none and dones. And right. I said, well, you won't be none and done forever. Because at some point, you will have to ask yourself that question, what is this all for? And you will, right? If you're given enough time to think about it, purpose, we all have this feeling that there should be a purpose. I think everybody has a feeling that there's got to be a purpose, thus the cry for justice. There has to be something, there has to be a reason for all of this suffering. There has to be, and so, yeah, like you said, you've got that horizon, right, rushing at you. And I think I've seen people who have stood defiantly and watched it come straight for them and said, I'm not going to give in. I'm just going to stand here and let it smack me right in the face and it'll be over. I've seen that. They're not happy people though.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't think that most people can do that. And that may be why we're in a meaning crisis. Because you do get these people who maybe they've got that internal stoicism or something, and they can go, well, I know I've, just got this brief life, whatever. And this is what the, like the existential philosophers will recommend to people, suck it up. It's all for nothing, and kind of like C.S. Lewis even talks about having that attitude before he converted, that he was real sure that there was nothing beyond, and that, and not only that even in terms of the whole human family, we end up on this, cinder floating out in empty space. It's cold, empty space at some point. And just the difference that it made for him to finally get to know Christ was like the opening up of a whole universe of joy that he hadn't known before. So while it's true that there are some people who can make that, real stoical existential move, and they're the realists, they accept the reality that there's nothing beyond this life, and they're going to be brave in the face of death. But I just don't think that most people are are able to do that. And God doesn't seem to think that most people should do that.
But
No.
as you're talking, Mary, I had this sudden flashback to when I was, I want to say maybe 21 or 20, 21, 22, something like that. I can remember several times walking around. I'm just walking, and this thought came into my head: what if I died before I ever really lived? I had this very strong conscious thought that I had not really lived yet, and it would be possible that I could die before I ever really lived. But somehow I boxed up that thought and stuffed it inside somewhere and never thought it again for 12 years or something. Because it wasn't until I was 32 that I opened my heart to the Lord, and it was a long, painful journey to get there. And during that time, I wasn't thinking about that stuff at all. I wasn't thinking about meaning or purpose or any of those things. I was just doing life, just trying to get by and make things work and take care of my kid and have some sort of a marriage and try to have friends and try to have something to do. And maybe it's just a certain personality type, but I'm very good at putting things in a box and hiding it away someplace. And I'm guessing that some other people are like that as well. And I could even spend many years not even thinking about the horizon. In fact, I saw a news article today that just kind of blew me away about this 84-year-old billionaire. He's the 47th richest man in the world. He's got, I don't know how many billions. He's moving himself and his whole project from New York to Miami so that he can reduce his tax burden. He's already got $47 billion or something like this, and he's worried about his tax burden. I mean, he's 84 years old. How do you even spend $84 million? You can't even begin to spend it. So how do you spend $84 billion and still to be worried that you're, and I don't like taxes either. So my point isn't about taxes. I'm not saying,
Right.
oh, I'll pay all the taxes. I'm just saying, how can that be the thing you're thinking about when you're 84? He's not looking at the horizon. And there are a lot of people who are not looking at the horizon because they've put that in a box and they've sealed up the box and they're just not going to look at it. And they don't even have their little chin stuck out saying, I'm not going to look at it. It just doesn't even cross their path. I really think that's true.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there are people like that. But back to that idea of having taken away the transcendent from our culture, you can live life and then you can have quality of life. And I think a lot of people who live life without the transcendent suffer in their quality of life. I think that their quality of life is affected because there's no justice, right? For all the things that have happened to you, the wrongdoings. There's going to be a lot of regrets because you've only got the one life and it's over. You'll never see so-and-so again. You should have gone when you had the chance, There's going to be all these things that come down on you and just rest there and stay there and become heavy and unbearable. And like when I was 5 years old, I was staying with my grandmother for the summer, and I had my own room, and I was usually in a room with my sister because we were only two years apart. So it was the first time I had my own room, and it was a simple, just a little cot and a little dresser, and I was laying in this room, and I think I was probably feeling a little afraid because I was alone, and I think it might have been when I first arrived. And I'm laying in the dark and I was thinking about dying. And I can imagine that probably everybody goes through a little phase in that age you know, say between 5 and 10, where they realize their mortality, you know, I'm going to die, right? And I was thinking about dying, and I was thinking, okay, what is dying? You know, I didn't think, okay, I'm going to die. And then I got scared. I wanted to examine it. I wanted to look at it. And I remember very clearly thinking, I was like outside of myself, watching myself thinking about dying. Okay, if you can imagine. And I thought, how that thing that is thinking about dying doesn't die. Okay, that me that is this body, I understood that my body will die. But I had this sudden, like, revelation that what makes me, what makes me think about dying, that doesn't die. And I didn't come from a Christian family. I didn't have church background, nothing, okay? Just laying in this bed in the dark. And I thought, I don't die. I don't die. Me, this thing that's me, right? And that lifted me from my bed every morning ever since that moment. That gave me joy, you know, that made me love my neighbor. That connection to the transcendent, because I thought, if I don't die, then I have a purpose. I am worth something. I have a value, right? And that value, my logic told me that the fact that I was valuable meant that somebody loved me. Something loved me. And it wanted me to live. It wanted that me that it made to be forever. And that's what I got out of that, you know. And you know, I've had friends say to me, and, you know, not in a Christian setting at all, you know, how come you're so hopeful? How come you're so happy? How come? And I said, because when I look up into the stars, I know. That's all I could say. But it's this idea of being connected to this transcendent thing, right? And, you know, you think about these kids in their dormitories under books and peer pressure and financial debt, and they have no connection to the transcendent, because that would just be foolish. Why would you think that way? That's just, you know, I had people say that to me. Why do you think that? What do you know? I said, I don't know, but I just know.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had a very different kind of experience. I had a very difficult kind of childhood, and I grew up a Jehovah's Witness, so we had I was never taught a concept of dying and going to heaven, or dying and being with God after this life. The concept that you grew up with in the Jehovah's Witnesses is that there's going to be a paradise on earth, and that if God approves of you, you will live forever in that paradise on earth. In, you know, as the person that you are, you won't go through any kind of transformation, like to have the you know, the glorious body like Christians believe that you have in the resurrection. So they do believe that people will come back from the dead, but it's more like a recreation of the person rather than a resurrection, because they believe that while the person is dead, they're actually non-existent. And what resurrection means is God recreates them. So it's like a clone of you, a copy of you, and you get to live in paradise. But I also was being taught, like at the time that I was growing up, they were always hammering into our heads that Armageddon was right around the corner. And so, you know, that we could probably not ever die, because Armageddon would come, and then the wicked world would be destroyed, but we would be protected. And then we would kind of like march over the dead bodies of all of our neighbors and their crumbled houses and churches and all, and then we would make the paradise on earth. So that was that was the conception of life and of the future that I was actually taught as a child. But I can remember having a very strong sense, I had a very strong sense of right and wrong. I had a very strong sense of God as being good. But I can remember actually praying as a child, of saying to God, so I didn't want to do anything to make God angry with me. I didn't want to be bad. I didn't want to make God disapprove of me. But this idea of continuing to live and live and live was just terrible, because the life that I was living as a child. So I can remember actually praying and saying to God, I want to be on your side. I don't want to displease you, but please don't make me live forever. So that was, so it wasn't until, pardon?
That's interesting.
So it wasn't until I got out of the, Jehovah's Witnesses and became a Christian and really understanding that you can't separate like your experience. You can't separate eternal life from God. Knowing God is eternal life.
Mm-hmm.
So, then I got that later on as an adult. But I remember saying that to God when I was a child.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you're in suffering too, right? Who wants to? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess I thought of death as a sort of an escape.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that it would be, but I didn't think there was anything. I didn't think that dead people had an existence. Like, I didn't think they believe in a hell or anything like that. That they just, if they died, they were non-existent. So I kind of was wanting the non-existence part of it, because I've thought of life as a kind of a burden. But that was just my experience. But you were very blessed to have the experience you did as a child, I think.
Yeah, there was another element to it which doesn't really relate to our conversation topic, but I'll just share it with you anyways, because I think you would appreciate it. So I'm in this headspace where I'm thinking, okay, I don't die. And now that I know more, I know that I was thinking about consciousness. It was the concept of consciousness that I thought doesn't die. The thing that makes me who I am. And then I thought, well, if this thing is going to live forever, and there is eternity, then the whole idea of evil and Satan, and because I had these little kid stories, witches and stuff like that, then maybe I could have some magical superpower, right? I could ask the devil to give me some magical superpower. And so I thought, I'm going to make a deal with the devil. And then and this is just all in my head, right? And then the devil said to me, what is it that you would like? And I said, I want to be able to move things around, with my mind. That was my superpower. And then we were about to shake on it, mentally, right? Shake on the deal. And then all of a sudden this other voice came into my head and said, wait, why don't you try me? And I had no church upbringing, okay? None. And I thought, and I knew it was God. And I said, oh, okay. And I didn't feel afraid. Like, I wasn't afraid to make a deal with the devil. And he said, what is it that you would like from me? And I didn't ask him for my superpower. I thought about it, and I thought, I want wisdom. That's what I said. And he said, okay.
So,
are you there?
yeah, I have to ask you, Shari. You're there. We just lost you for a second, but you finished what you were saying. But I have to ask you, how old
Yeah, okay.
when this happened?
Okay. I was 5.
And what kind of things had you been reading prior to that? This was before you read the poems of Robert Frost?
Yeah, that was in grade 1.
Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand. I cannot fathom how a child that age could have any sense of their personhood.
Yeah,
To start
I know
with,
when I think,
and to have such a personal encounter with the two forces that that you encountered, that just is inconceivable. It's amazing.
yeah, you know, I always kind of, that was the thing that I put in a little box. I was, for many years as a child, that was my secret, right? I asked God for something and I was going to wait and see if he gave it to me. And I didn't want to tell anyone because I thought if I did, it would jinx it, you know, it would ruin it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I became a Christian, later on in my early 20s, I was afraid to tell anyone about it because I thought, oh, you know, I was talking to Satan as a child. Maybe I'm possessed, you know. And I just never really told anybody. And I kept it there. I just, you know, like, you know how in the scriptures it talks about when Mary, Jesus's mother, heard something, she just kept it in her heart and she pondered it. I really relate that to that because that's what I did with that whole thing. I just kept it in my heart and I pondered it, you know. And I never felt ever in my life without God, you know. And I can only relate it back to that experience. Yeah. And I don't really know why I, you know, had it. I just did. You know, I asked a lot of questions as a child. My mother told me that she said to me one time, I used to lock myself in my room when you were little because you asked me questions that I couldn't answer. And I always thought that was really strange. So I think I had a very inquiring mind, you know. And I was always exploring things, you know, ideas. So, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I always had a very strong sense, even as a small child, of there being a realm of evil and a realm of good. I mean, I knew that deeply and intuitively, even although, see, I was just given this framework to put it in by the teachings of the Jehovah's Witnesses. So I responded from that framework, but intuitively, I had that same sense that there was a good side and there was an evil side, and that I wanted to be on the side of what was good. I didn't want the reward that they were telling me that you would get for that. But I didn't want to have God displeased with me. I didn't want to displease him in order to not have that reward of living forever on earth be imposed on me, if that makes any sense. So.
Well, and when we're little, I mean,
Yeah.
Children have such a strange way of seeing the world anyway, because our mental matrix isn't filled out yet. So we're getting all these data points, but there's no place.
Sorry about this, guys. I'm just running out of battery here.
Oh, okay.
That you're taking in all the data, but you have no connections for the data. So it just rolls around in your head. So I can remember being probably 4 or 5 years old, and I did not grow up in a religious household. Nobody ever took me to church or taught me anything about faith or religion or anything. But somewhere along the line, my mother, I think she gave me a little plaque with "Now I lay me down to sleep" on it, and maybe showed me how to read it or something. And I remember every night for the rest of, as long as I could remember, even up into my 20s, I prayed that prayer every night, and it was almost some kind of a talisman, because I knew I knew there were bad things that could get me, and somehow I thought, there was a part of me, it's almost like that, don't step on a crack or you'll break your mother's back.
Yeah.
I don't pray this prayer, the bad stuff is going to happen to me. So it wasn't that I had any sense of closeness to the Lord or any of those things in the prayer, but if I said the prayer, I would be safe. I could.
It was superstitious.
Yeah. So
superstition.
It was very superstitious use of the prayer.
Yeah.
But I think that's because it was given to me when I was a child, and it got hooked into the wrong connections inside my brain. So I didn't know what it meant or what it was for. And I didn't step on cracks either, you know. And I was thinking about this book. In fact, I was watching Casey and Julian in their conversation, which is amazing. Such an amazing conversation. And I actually made a comment on there to Casey that I thought it would be good for her to get this book that's called A Bump in the Night, Things That Go Bump in the Night.
Is that James Thurber?
No, this is a parenting book.
Oh.
Probably written 25 years ago or something, because I got it when my daughter was little. And it's about children that have a lot of fear and anxiety. And why is it that some children, when they're 3 or 4, they have so much fear and anxiety and so much separation anxiety, and the kids that end up in therapy. And he's explaining that part of the reason those children end up in therapy is that their parents parent them without an understanding of the developmental stages that children go through.
Oh.
And I will remember so clearly, one of the examples was a young man who was just filled with fear and anxiety and had all these mental problems as a young man. And the therapist was trying to figure out where things had gone wrong and how he got to that place. And then at one point, the therapist said, "Hey, Bob, show me how you tie your shoes." And so Bob tied his shoes, and it was a way that he had never seen anybody tie his shoes before, ever. And he said, "Bob, how did you learn to tie your shoes that way?" And the kid thought back, and he said, "Well, when I was little, my dad said, 'Tie your shoes, we got to go.' And I didn't know how to tie my shoes. Nobody taught me how to tie my shoes. And he was yelling and screaming at me. And, you know, he said, I just figured out something." But that's an example of how sometimes when children are in an angry household, they will just figure out something to make life work so they don't get yelled at anymore. But they don't know how to do the thing. And it may not be something as pedantic as tying your shoes. It may be something about how to deal with life. But if nobody ever taught you how to deal with life and you just figure it out on your own, you poke it into your matrix wherever you can and just try to make connections work. But then many, many years later, here you are with all these flawed connections. And I certainly found that in my life. I mean, I grew up in a very angry household, and a lot of my growing up was trying to figure out how to navigate my parents' anger with each other and with me, and how to keep peace in the household. But I never knew that that's what was happening until I was in my 40s. Then I heard somebody talk about this stuff, and I looked back and I'm like, oh, I did not grow up in a normal household. I had no idea. I just thought that's the way people grew up, that you just have to figure things out on your own, that nobody's ever going to teach you anything, right? So I really feel for children that don't have someone patiently, lovingly teaching them the things that they need to learn in order to grow up and develop and make the connections that they need, right?
This is something we've been talking about on the Discord chat. I'm often, because yesterday I spent like 4 hours cleaning onions for the farmer's market. So I just plug in and listen to the conversation that people are having, right? And we've been talking a lot about agapic love. I was really impressed with John Vervaeke's explanation of agape in his lecture series. And I loved it because it's exactly what I would imagine the explanation to be. It's loving someone into being, you know? Like he made the distinction between phileo and eros because both of those are, eros is consuming, right? So you can love Coca-Cola, he says, and it doesn't have to be sexual. You're loving something because you're consuming it. And phileo is cooperative, so you love that person because you can cooperate with them. But when you bring a child home from the hospital and you look at it, you can't consume it, nor can you cooperate with it. But yet you love it. But you love it in agapically. You love it into being, right? You're not manipulating it. It's like I used on one of the chats. I used the example of like a sculptor coaxing the form out of the stone. You know, it's already there, and they're coaxing it out. You know, and that's how God loves us. He loves us into being, you know, which for me, I've really struggled a lot over the years with a lot of Christian theology because it felt too condemning and too judgmental. You know, God is so much more gracious than a lot of that doctrine and theology. And it's, you know, being in relationship with him to me is constantly in that exploratory mode of discovering who I am because he continuously loves me into being, you know.
Wow, Shari, that just brought up so much stuff. So when you're talking about the connection between that loving our babies into being and a sculptor finding the sculpture in the stone, of course my mind immediately went to art. And when my mind went to art, I started thinking about there's certain kinds of paintings that I do where for whatever reason a lot of chaos shows up. Maybe I'm having a hard time finding my way forward in a painting, so I'll add some chaos. And once I add the chaos, then I see my way forward. And then I begin to tease out what's really there. And I begin to bring forth from the painting something until I see it. And then I sort of love it into being. Okay. So someday maybe I'll show you an example of a painting that comes from that particular strain of my work. But
yeah,
I was thinking about how, I don't know if you had a chance to hear the very first conversation I had with Alex. I think Mary heard it.
I did.
We were talking about stochastic resonance.
Right.
Yeah.
So in science, there is this thing where when a signal, a waveform signal, like a radio signal or some kind of signal like that, is just below the threshold of perception. Like maybe they have a radio signal, but you can't quite hear what the people are trying to say. The way that they capture what the people are actually saying is they add some white noise to the signal. They add some chaos to the signal. And when they add the chaos is coming in at all these random frequencies. And some of those random frequencies will connect up with the actual frequencies, and it will boost the signal just enough to bring it up to the perceptible level so you can actually hear what the people are saying. And I think that's the way it is with our lives, that the Lord deals with each of us so patiently that a lot of times we don't know who we are. So our signal isn't even up at our own threshold of perception. much less being able to allow other people to see who we are, because we always have these hidden places. And so he allows this chaos to come into our lives that just amps up the signal enough to where we get a picture of who we are. And so that chaos coming in can cause a lot of stress and anxiety and sometimes pain and suffering and all those other things. But as we work through that, our signals get built up and we begin to get a better picture of who we are. And it's like he's loving us into being, but it's through these random things that come into our lives that he's using to kind of help us.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes any sense, but
I think that's a great illustration. Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when the sculptor is coaxing the sculpture out of the stone, he's using a hammer and a chisel, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
it's not that pretty.
He's also removing stuff, right?
Yeah.
It's that withdrawal. Yeah. And I've been studying a lot lately about randomness and emergent systems and things like that. And at the same time, I've been and withdrawing space is one of the elements of that. And at the same time, I've been looking at that. I've been kind of hearing these theological strains of, I don't quite remember what it was, but one of these, I believe, Hebrew concepts of God at the very beginning, when God and the universe, I mean, when God is completely unified, all one, before the Big Bang, in order for space to be, because God is outside of time and space, so in order for space to exist, God withdrew himself just a little bit. And as he withdrew himself just a little bit, that created space. Mm. And then I don't remember the whole rest of the story, but then time comes out of that as well. And so then the universe begins to form. But it's this, there's something in that picture of God withdrawing himself a little bit, because I've certainly experienced that in my life, that sometimes he withdraws himself and it's terrifying, because I think, oh no, what's happening? But what he's really doing is making space for other things to fill in and get built up, you know. I'm not saying it very well, but anyway.
No, I get it.
If you have a relationship with a person and you're going to see them face to face, there has to be a space between you. Otherwise, you cannot see them.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I think that, you know, God is in God pulling back from us makes it possible for us to have a personal relationship with him, to see him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, that's kind of what we do if we're, you know, healthy parents. That's what we do with our kids, right? We don't hover over them and smother them. We pull back from them and let them discover who they are, you know, mm-hmm. those parameters, right? In that beautiful garden.
How many children do you have, Shari?
I have 3. Yeah.
Boys,
2 girls and a boy.
2 girls and a boy.
2 girls, a girl, a boy, a girl. Yeah.
How about you, Mary?
Well, I have 4 children. I lost one of my 4 children, so I have 3 living children.
Oh.
They're all grown up now, and I have 9 grandchildren. So some of them are grown up too. So
I have
grandmothers before too long.
I have 3 grandchildren. The oldest is 14, and then 12, and then 6 or 7. I think she's 7 this November. Youngest grandchild.
How do they like having a farmer for a grandmother?
Well, they're in Switzerland, so they never. They always. Yeah, they get videos of lambs being born and all that stuff. They love it. Yeah, but I don't see them very often.
Well, yeah, Switzerland is a long ways away. Do you get over there?
I've been, the last time I went was about 2.5 years ago. But the biggest problem for me is getting away from the farm.
Oh,
I
sure.
could go more often,
Yeah.
but it's just, it's a lot of work for my husband on his own because he works, right, as well. And I hate handing over all my babies to some stranger.
Yeah, otherwise I was going to say you could have like an Airbnb and invite somebody to come for a week to do farm work.
Well, I did one year have we were part of WOOF Canada, which is willing workers on organic farms. I don't think that's what they call themselves anymore. It's worldwide something or other anyway. But it's just people from all over the world that come and work with us and for room and board. And we've done that for many years. We didn't do it this year, but we've done it, for a number of years now. And I've had a couple of roofers stay and look after things, but I'm just a nervous ninny, not knowing, if everything is okay. And the worst part is we're here all summer because that's our busiest time, the garden. And then in the wintertime is when we could travel, but that's the hardest time for anyone to be here to look after things. Winter is tough, right? So. Yeah.
Well, I have 2 daughters and 1 granddaughter who's 13. So my youngest daughter's 25, and she's still just starting out in life. She just started her first big job, so that's been fun to watch her grow into that.
She's the one that's
exciting.
been helping you with the technology, right?
Yeah, she's really sharp on technology. So she's got a technology job here in Silicon Valley, which is great.
Yeah, you shouldn't have any problem finding some tech person to help you out there.
Well, everybody's so busy here, Shari.
Yeah.
When I first moved to California, the hardest thing for me, and I moved here in 1990, and the hardest thing for me was when I started developing a social life, and I would say to people, well, let's make plans you come over to my place for dinner, or let's have lunch, and they'd get out their calendar. Yeah, I could do dinner 3 months from Wednesday. Let's see, November. In Iowa, you ask somebody for dinner, they come that night.
Yeah.
So I was completely bollocksed by this fact that there's too much to do here. First of all, everybody works 60-hour weeks, but then they go parasailing, and they go horseback riding, and they go skiing, and they go windsurfing, and there's just, the weather is perfect all the time, so everybody is always out doing something, and they have really, really active lives, and they just don't have that much time for socializing. Where I used to live in the winter in Iowa, people would get snowed in together accidentally and end up spending 3 days together when the power goes out and you can't dig out to get out of the driveway. You really get to know people, right?
Yeah.
Are either of you or both of you part of church congregations, or do you go to church and have a church family?
Yes, I go to a fairly big, well, it's a big church. It is a big church at 6 different campuses. So each church is not very big, about 200 people, but then we have like 6 campuses in the Bay Area. It's called Menlo Church, and it's roughly non-denominational, although it's connected roughly to the Presbyterian kind of idea. I'm not a theologian at all, but I think after listening to Paul for a while that the church I go to is somewhat Calvinist.
Right, it would be.
I think there's some connection to the Calvinist idea.
Yeah.
But,
and I haven't gone to church for about 20 years. So when before I got married, I was in a church. After we got married, we continued to go to church. We had little kids, we were a little family. We went to church. Mm-hmm. And when we first moved back to Canada in 1997, we moved to a very remote, even more remote than where I am now. It was just below the Yukon border, and it was about 700 kilometers to the nearest grocery store. So it was really remote. And there was a little hand.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
know. Wow.
There was a handful of believers there, and they met together in a church, in a house, like house setting.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that for a little while, or we did that as a family, actually. And then things kind of fizzled in that regard. And then we came here, and I have, there's a bigger story around why I don't go to church, but I can't really talk about it on YouTube. But we could talk about it sometime. And
but you've kept your faith alive, obviously. So that's
oh yeah, my faith has never dimmed, not for a minute, not for one moment. And I live kind of I really like imagine myself holding hands with the Lord and walking up to my milk barn with my bucket. And I walk with my goats, and I just look at everything that God has made and how absolutely amazing it is and how it all fits together. And I was watching my goats browsing, and they browse, so they want to eat everything, and everybody thinks goats will eat anything, but let me tell you, they're very fussy. But anyway, so I take them out to this clear-cut area, and there's lots of willow and shrubs and, things that they like to eat. And so they go from little bush to little bush, and they can only eat up as high as they are tall. And sometimes, they'll get on their back feet and pull a branch down and, kind of win it that way, right? Win the game that way. But really, they can only go as high as they are tall, and then they don't devastate a tree. They never devastate it. They just, they're like a gardener. They just clip it all nicely, tuck, 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 and then they go to the next one. And if you know anything about gardening, when you do that, what they're doing is they're gardening. They're ensuring their survival. They're pruning back all these bushes, and they're encouraging more and more growth. Mm-hmm. So that if I move them to a different area, walk with them in a different place, and come back a couple weeks later, those willows are bigger than they were the first time we met them, right? More food on them. And when I see things like that, I praise God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The only animals I have right now are chickens. I want to get some ducks, and I would love to have some goats someday. But I just see the way that they're so fitted for their environment and their little social hierarchy that they have going. And to me, every time that I pick up an egg, I just think it's a miracle. You realize an egg is one cell, right?
Is it really?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
An egg is one cell.
Wow.
Well, and do you know that inside, I mean, we used to raise chickens, and when we would butcher them, we didn't just use them for eggs, we would butcher them. When you butcher a laying hen, every egg that she will ever lay is inside her. So they go all the way down to this little point size, and they're all right in there. It's and I'm sure
it's not every egg she'll ever lay, but it's all the eggs for like the next month or the next few weeks are there. But I've seen that the little tiny, and they're all like the little gold yolks is what you get out of the hen, and so you can line them up in order of size all the way down to the littlest one that's like the size of almost like the head of a pin or something. Yeah, I've seen that inside of a laying hen when you butcher them. So this will freak some people out that we're talking about killing them.
It's a terrible thing to end on, but I think we're going to have to end. So.
Okay.
Oh, we got to end on that note. We should think of something happy.
Well,
I don't know. I'll tell you what. The bone broth that you make from the chickens that you raise is
Yeah.
very happy.
Very, very good.
And I'm going to just tie it back to hope here, because I saw on Twitter yesterday some pastor had made a comment. There's a pastor that I follow, and I usually like what he has on there, but he had made some comment like, you know, the one thing that every Christian should be is happy. And,
Yeah.
and I put a little, I replied to it, and I noticed today the comment is gone. So I don't know, maybe he didn't like my reply, but my reply was, let's rephrase that, : they always have hope. And because it made me think about that song, you know, the song At the Cross? At the cross where I first saw the light,
Yeah.
my soul rolled away. It was there by faith that I
Received my sight.
there by faith I received my sight, and now I am happy all the day.
Yeah.
And when I used to sing that hymn, I could never sing that last line because I thought, that's not quite right. It's not that I'm not happy, but that's not really what's happening, you know. Now
No.
I have joy,
Right.
a deep seated, very grounded in hope, but it's not happy, because there are a lot of days I'm not happy, especially if I look around at, you know, I look around at the world, or I think about my own inadequacies and all of those things, you know. I mean, whatever kind of headspace I can get into where I'm not happy. But if I just stop for a moment into that center of being that Shari was talking about, where the me that is actually me resides, you know, my consciousness, that is where I know I have that relationship with Christ, and that is where my hope is. So my hope is found in nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Amen to that. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Right.
That's a good note.
Our
That's a
life
good
is
note.
hid. Our life is hid with Christ in God, like St. Paul says.
Yeah.
And all the mysteries of God are hidden in Christ.
Yeah.
And all the promises of God are yes in Christ.
Yes. Amen.
Yeah, that's a better note.
Good talking with you. I love this.
Great
Yeah,
talking
it was
with
great.
you also.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Love you, ladies.
Bye.